that pressing my buttons. So welcome, Kathleen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome. And it's really nice to be with you again. I definitely recognize some faces and names, and I've been looking forward to seeing all of you and talking about gardening since Julie contacted me some weeks ago. So I'll start by sharing my screen, and yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to take questions. Even if you want to just, at some point, just pipe up and, ask a burning question, please feel free to do so. Julie, can you remind me how much time we have for the presentation before the questions?
Oh, well, it really depends, 30 to 45 minutes. So however, 40 minutes would be good.
Okay.
Whatever you have. And if people interrupt with pressing questions, then we can go longer.
Okay, sounds good. So I've kept not all, but some of the slides from last time to do a very quick review. So I'm going to run through these quickly. So I work for Pollinator Partnership Canada, as Julie mentioned, and we are a national level environmental charity focused on pollinators. And so we definitely, have a focus on pollinators, but we also see it as a lens through which to see ecosystem restoration, ecosystem protection. And so pollinators, I think, are a really great way of understanding how terrestrial ecosystems around us work, because they are what helps plants reproduce, and plants, of course, are the foundation of terrestrial food chains. Not all plants, not all plants are pollinated, but many of them are. Now, pollinators include lots of different taxa, lots of different groups of organisms. There are the insects, of course, which include beetles and ants and wasps and flies and bees and moths and butterflies to a certain degree. But you also have some pollinating reptiles and pollinating mammals. Oh, and I forgot bats. Bats are important pollinators in tropical and neotropical areas. So anyone who likes mezcal, for example, you can thank the bats that pollinate it. In terms of bees, there are only over 20,000 species around the world. In Canada, we have well over 800. I think we're near 900 species of bees. In Toronto, where I'm usually stationed, we have, I think, 369 bees and counting. Which is considerable considering that it is a very dense urban area. Oh yeah, and in North America, 4,000 native bees. So bees, of course, are the most efficient pollinators because they, of all of the other pollinators, are the only ones that have really evolved to collect pollen. And they collect pollen because that's what they feed to their larvae, to their babies. And one of their evolutionary adaptations is to have all of these hairs which capture the pollen while they're foraging. Bees also drink the nectar, so adult bees drink the nectar, and that's how they fuel themselves. It's very high in sugar. It's very high sugar content, so lots of energy. And some bees also eat pollen as adults. Oh, I'm missing a slide. Why should we care? Well, of course, we should care about the bees and the pollinators because they're an integral part of our ecosystems. And it's also a bit self-serving because, of course, they pollinate a lot of our food. So these are our produce choices with bees and produce choices without bees. So they are also involved in meat production and dairy because a lot of the forage that cows eat, for example, are dependent on the pollination services of bees, for example, alfalfa. So 1 in 3 bites of food is dependent to a certain extent on the pollination services of insects. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, they help a huge amount of wild plants in natural ecosystems reproduce. So everyone's familiar with honeybees, of course. They are what we call a superorganism. They are very social. You can think of a colony as a single organism made up of tens of thousands of individual parts. And the honeybees, I think, especially for this group, one of the important things to understand is honeybees are not a native species. They were brought to North America with early European settlers for honey production and for hive products like beeswax, of course. Now, most of the money that beekeepers make is not from honey or beeswax, but from their pollination services. So commercial beekeepers rent out their hives to large farms, for example, blueberries or squash or canola or alfalfa, for their pollination services. So lots of people want to help the bees and think I'll get a hive for my backyard to help save the bees. And honeybees are fascinating, they're wonderful, and they're very important in agriculture. But if you want to help the bees, I would ask you to think about getting a hive. Think about it a few times, even more than a few times. Think about it a lot, because they're a lot of work, and honeybees actually have a lot of diseases, and their diseases transfer to wild bees. And there is some evidence that honeybees have an impact on wild bees, not only in terms of disease transfer, but also from being in competition with wild bees for the available pollen and nectar in the landscape. Oh, yeah, that's what I was just talking about. Bumblebees. So bumblebees we have, I think, almost 40 species of bumblebees. They're also social. So they are living colonies centered around a queen that does all the egg laying. And then her daughters are the workers. They go and forage and they bring back pollen. And that's what feeds the next generation of bumblebees. They have lots of different life cycle strategies, but many of them you'll find nesting in old rodent burrows, or in cracks in masonry, or in compost piles, or in piles of leaves. So they're very hard to find. So if you ever find a bumblebee nest, you're a very lucky person. Okay, so here are some examples of places where you might find a bumblebee nest. So keep this in mind when you are designing your garden, but especially when you're cleaning up your garden, because some of these natural areas like piles of leaves, piles of twigs, your ornamental grasses in the fall when they're drying up and falling over, those can be excellent bumblebee nesting sites. Most bees, however, are not social like the honeybees and the bumblebees. They are solitary. The vast majority of wild bees in Canada are solitary, and 70% of them live in the ground. They build tunnels in the soil. And so here's another hint for the wildlife gardeners out there, is leave a few patches of bare soil, especially if it is south-facing, on a slope and well-drained. Those could be some very good areas for many solitary bees to dig their nests. 30% of solitary bees are cavity nesting, and you will find them in twigs and also in old masonry. So we'll see a few pictures of that soon. Oh, there we go. So lots of people are into buying bee hotels or making bee hotels. The very best thing is, of course, what nature would do on its own. So sumac, elderberry, raspberries, these are all native shrubs that you will find usually in abundance, especially the sumac, in some rural areas, in natural areas, in old fields. These all have pithy stems. That means that the center of the stem is either hollow or can easily be burrowed by a bee that's making her nest. So elderberry is also wonderful for its flowers that attract pollinators. Raspberry also loved by pollinators for its flowers, and by birds for its fruit, and by humans, of course, for its fruit. So we have a raspberry bush in our garden, and it's very popular with everyone. So what we do is, at the end of the season, we'll cut the canes, the stems, a few feet off the ground, and they dry, and come the next spring, the bees will go and make their nests in there. So we're always very careful when we're pruning our raspberries not to just throw away the old stems. We usually put a pile in the back corner of the garden after we think that most of them have left their nest, the new bees have left their nest. But sometimes, there might be some in there that we haven't noticed. So we're careful with our plant debris. Mining bees. So this is one of the big family of bees. They're mostly soil dwellers, and they are quite adorable and kind of stocky. You'll see their back legs are usually fairly robust because they are the diggers. This is a specific species of bees, and I'm just like to show it because it's so beautiful. It's blue. People, we often think of bees as being black and yellow, but there's a huge range of color out there that's really worth appreciating. Sweat bees are also a really fascinating group, and this bee, actually Agapossum onvarescens, is the official bee of the city of Toronto because it will share a nest entrance with other mother bees, but each one will have its own nest and its own tunnels, but they'll take turn guarding. And so it's kind of like sharing an apartment complex. I kind of think about it as the punk rock bee because it's metallic green and has the black and white stripes. It's also called the sweat bee because in this family, you'll often have little sweat bees come and lick your sweat. So if you've ever had that experience, that was a sweat bee. Leafcutter bees are beautiful, fascinating. As you can see by their name and by this picture, they like to use leaves to line the inside of their nest. So they make little cells, and within those cells is where they lay their eggs and deposit pollen for the eggs. And they do that using these leaves. And I had a wild rose shrub in my garden, and it's a very popular choice for leafcutter bees because they won't just cut any leaf. And we'll get into those relationships a little later on in the presentation. But for anyone who wants to track leafcutter bees, wild rose is a hit. Carpenter bees, the largest bee, easily confused with the bumblebees, but it's not quite as hairy, and it has a very shiny black abdomen. And you will often find it in your shed or in your deck. So I don't mind them personally. Some people feel a bit bothered, but most of the time with the vast majority of bees, if you can get very close to them, as long as you're not actively bothering their nest or just about to crush them, they will not sting you. Why are pollinators declining? Lots of reasons, unfortunately, and they all interact with each other. So of course, climate change is a huge one. I mentioned diseases, land use intensification, which is kind of like a big umbrella term to talk both about what's going on in agriculture, bigger fields with fewer types of crops and more pesticides, more intense pesticides. That's one aspect of intensification, but also habitat loss in terms of losing the kinds of landscapes we had. So cities becoming bigger, suburbs becoming cities, and then farmland becoming suburbs. And within these spaces, losing some of the plant biodiversity that we used to have. And then another important one for us gardeners is alien species. And so alien species, a term for species of plants, animals, fungus, basically any living organism that somehow makes its way into a new ecosystem where it has not co-evolved with the others for an extended geological period of time, let's say. And in plants in particular, this is an issue for bees because plants and bees have co-evolved very, very close relationship. And we'll get into that for a second. So alien species are species that are coming from other ecosystems that don't have a relationship. Not all alien species are a big issue, but a few of them are, and they're usually the very invasive ones, the very aggressive ones. So here in this photo, we see a forest understory that is covered, just absolutely covered with garlic mustard. It's very aggressive. And what it does is it exudes a toxin through its roots that prevents other plants from growing. All right, so this is some examples what this habitat destruction and fragmentation looks like. So now let's get to the juicier part of our presentation and what we didn't cover last time, which is what can we do as gardeners? So the big thing here is natural gardens, and natural gardens can mean a lot of different things, and we can go through that. But in a lot of ways, I would say to have a bit of a Zen or Taoist approach, a relaxed approach. You can mow less, You can rake less. You can put out fewer garden waste bags. Definitely avoid using pesticides. And then that's kind of a first level, but the second level is to look to nature, at how nature gardens, and then tweak that for your own aesthetic style, your own interest in plants, your own your own style. You can look to nature and develop your own style within that. And that is, as a guiding principle, how to garden for pollinators. So let's look at that in a bit more detail. So one of the first things, and this is a movement that's coming out of the UK, is No Mow May. So I wanted to include it because May is, 2 days from now. And it's a nice one because it's an example of getting more by doing less. And so, especially at this time of year, early spring, there are not many nectar resources out in the landscapes, especially in suburbs. That's very often the case. But you can find in your lawn various species of weeds, quote unquote, that do provide pollen and nectar. On top of that, in your lawn, you often have larvae, you have eggs for various insects, and that's where they live. When we mow, we are not only destroying habitat, but often with the action of the mower, we might actually be injuring some of these insects. Now, it doesn't mean mow none of your lawn. It doesn't mean never mow, especially for people who have kids or dogs and you want a space. You want a space for everyone to run around and a soft area, then yes, definitely, maintain your lawn as you see fit. But in those areas, maybe they're off to the side, or they don't get that much traffic, or you're just not in a rush to mow. You can hold off, and that can make a significant difference. Fast forward to the end of the season. Leave the leaves. This is another campaign that's really taken off, and this is a really important one. Leaves are a huge resource for gardeners. Anyone who makes compost, you want in your compost 70% brown matter, 30% green matter. So your green matter is all your kitchen scraps. It's your fresh organic matter. Your brown matter is something like leaves, fall leaves, the dried leaves of trees, which are dry and they are full of carbon, which is what you want as the basis for your compost. So please do not put your leaves out in the yard waste bag. This is excellent mulch. You don't need to buy cedar chips. You can gather your leaves, spread that in your garden bed, around your plants. It'll help maintain the soil moisture over the hot summer months, but it also helps build the soil, not only in terms of carbon, but also soil organic matter. So all of the life in the soil, all the microorganisms, the mycorrhiza, everything that makes the soil a living substrate from which your plants can gather energy, gather life, gather defenses against diseases. A lot of that is the action of that mulching by the leaves. But on top of that, for pollinators, a lot of pollinators will overwinter in various life forms in the leaf mulch, especially many butterflies and moths. They will overwinter in their cocoons, in their chrysalids, in the leaf litter. So in your garden beds, under trees especially, you would naturally find the caterpillars, not the caterpillars, but the eggs and the cocoons of butterflies that are overwintering. And those leaves also provide some insulation against the cold. So leaves are a huge garden resource, not only for gardeners, for the health of your soil and your plants, but also for the pollinators. So let's talk about creating habitat in the garden. Habitat for our purposes here is as food, it's nesting, and it's host plants for butterflies and moths. So we all need something to eat. We need a place to live or to raise our children. And in the case of butterflies, you need a very specific plant on which to lay your eggs, and those are called host plants. So we'll get into those details. When we want to create habitat, let's say you're working with a conservation area, or let's say I'm working with a conservation area. Maybe it's a degraded field where there used to be a landfill or something. We are going to go and look at what historically might have been there, what's currently there in terms of plants, and what would do well. And we are going to reintroduce native plants. Those are the plants that have evolved in that area over thousands of years. And so they all have relationships with each other. They're adapted to the conditions in this place. And they also have relationships with all the wildlife, the insects, the reptiles, the amphibians, the mammals, the birds, all of these creatures in any given area. There is a complex and beautiful, wonderful web of relationships that ties everything together. So when we as gardeners want to create a wildlife garden or a pollinator garden, we want to use native plants, because what we're doing when we're introducing native plants into our garden is we're reintroducing relationships. And this has a exponential effect. As I said, native plants, they're adapted to your conditions. A lot of native plants, they can handle our cold winters. They can also handle our hot, dry summer with minimal and sometimes no extra watering. And they are absolutely gorgeous. I am a huge fan of native plants, and I'm actually going to take you on a tour of some of my favorites. When you're looking for plants for your garden, actually, let me go back for a second. So let me expand on the native plants. So I was talking about relationships. Plants and pollinators have specific life cycles. That means that come a point in the spring, could be early spring, late spring, early summer, plants will emerge. At some point, they'll bloom. A specific bee will also emerge at a specific time of the year. Those that have very close relationships, for example, the pollinators of blackcurrant, the bees that pollinate blackcurrant, they depend on that plant to be blooming when they come out of their nests. That's a close relationship. These are the kinds of relationships that we want to foster. What the native plants do is that they sustain these wild native pollinators in the landscape, and we're trying to reintroduce them into our garden. Native plants are getting increasingly popular, so I'm going to tell you to just keep an eye out for there are some caveats. So for example, wildflower seed mixes. I've seen them at Dollarama. It says wildflower seed mix. All flowers at some point were wild somewhere. The wildflower seed mix at Dollarama has wildflowers from all over the world, and they can be very pretty. Sometimes these wildflower mixes even have invasive species that shouldn't be sold in Canada. But often they're not wildflowers in the sense that we think of them as wildflowers, because they are not embedded in these relationships. They haven't evolved here, so they're not sustaining the local wildlife that we want to sustain. They're also what were called nativars. So I'm sure as gardeners, you've gone to the garden center, and there's a botanical name, the scientific name for a plant. Ooh, do we have a question? Nope. Okay. Oops. Just pipe up if you want to ask something.
We just had someone arrive. That's all.
Okay,
but maybe it's a good opportunity. Does anyone have a question? I know Mary Bond, you had a couple of questions, or would you prefer to wait till the end? Can't see.
Actually, it doesn't matter. So do the bees also overwinter? I.e., should we be watching out for them in the leaves? And
great question, Mary. Thank you. So bees only live one season, except for the honeybee queens. But just about every other bee species will only live one season. So The bees that we see emerging this spring and summer, they were laid as eggs last year by their mothers. And so they spent winter usually as a larva. And either as a larva or as a pupa, which is kind of just the pre-adult form. And they emerge for the first time in the new season as an adult. Does that answer your question?
Well,
Oh,
so if I have all the, like, I'm just about to rake up a lot of oak leaves and put them in compost, should I be watching out? Like, what should I be watching out for, I guess?
Well, for leaves, it's mostly cocoons. You'll have eggs from, not from bees, but from other insects. Bees, they're usually, you'll find them in the soil, which means like you won't find them. It's even people who are trained who are looking for them have a hard time finding bee nests. But you might find some cavity dwelling bees in the stems of some of your plants. So if you're pruning, that's something you can look out for. But in terms of leaves, that's usually the cocoons and the caterpillars of butterflies and moths, and as well as the eggs and the larvae and the nymphs of other insects.
Okay, so I have one more question. That's with respect to carpenter bees. Are these like carpenter ants that they destroy wood, like decks and stuff?
You'll definitely find lots of pest extermination companies advertising their services to get rid of carpenter bees. I've never heard of carpenter bees destroying a wooden structure. They do excavate a tunnel inside the wood. So it's something you can watch out for if it's in an area that you definitely want to protect. But I've never seen any like serious damage, not like carpenter ants, which can actually destroy your structure.
Okay, thank you.
I think we have a question from Diane before we go talking further about native plants. Diane Coutu.
What do non-native wildflowers do to the pollinators? I don't understand what damage it would do to them.
Oh, that's a great question. Thanks for giving me a chance to clarify. So it's not that they do damage, it's that they don't really provide much benefit. Most of them, not all of them. Of course, we're talking about nature, so it's complex, it's complicated. But a lot of the plants that you'll see in the garden center, first of all, they're non-native, so they don't have that relationship. So often the wild bees won't go visit them because they're not the right shape for them to be able to gather the pollen and the nectar, or they're just not attracted to them. Each plant has its own chemical signature, and a lot of these non-native plants just aren't attractive to bees. But on top of that, the vast majority of plants that have been grown for the horticulture industry have been grown for traits like looking beautiful to human eyes, having lots of petals, or lasting throughout the season, or having a certain size or certain colors. And through that breeding process, pollen and nectar production is often lost. So there's very little of it, or it can't actually be accessed by the insects. So most of the time, it's not that they're doing harm, it's just that they're not doing anything positive for them. Thanks for your question.
Like bee junk food, sounds like.
Kind of, yeah, absolutely. Or like a plastic apple that you're about to bite into, but then you realize there's nothing there to feed you.
Right. Okay, so if there's no other questions, people can, Joanne Leblanc has one. We'll go with one last question from Joanne before we move on, then everybody can hold on to their questions. Joanne?
Yes, and what about clover?
Oh, that's also a great question. So clover is a non-native species. There are lots of different types of clover. The clover you'll find in your lawn is a non-native species. And you will see honeybees on it, and you'll see bumblebees on it. Now, honeybees can really only get to the clover after it's been cut after the first bloom, and that has to do with the shape of the flower. Having clover in your lawn is great for fixing nitrogen, which is one of the nutrients that plants need to grow. And I like clover in my field. I wouldn't go and plant it to feed pollinators. I would plant it to have a beautiful, flowering lawn, and because it's good for the soil. And I wouldn't go out of my way to get rid of it by any means. And it's just kind of there anyways. So,
Okay.
but one of the things you'll see with plants that are non-native is you'll see what are called generalist pollinators. So some bees are generalists, like honeybees. Honeybees, you'll see them feeding on just about anything that they can. Bumblebees, most species are also generalists. That means they can feed on a lot of different things. A lot of species of bees are more specialized. They're kind of like picky eaters, and they've evolved to forage from a family of plants, and you won't see them on other things. So if you want to sustain a diversity of pollinators, and especially if you want to sustain those that are less common, those that are having a harder chance finding food in the landscape, then that's where the native plants become really important. Thanks for your question.
Great, so we can go on and just invite anybody who has a question, if you want to jot it down in the chat to remember it, or hold on to it, and we can come back to it later. Thanks, Kathleen.
Thank you. Okay, so nativars, as I was saying, they're the cultivars of native plants. So everyone knows black-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia hirta. If you see Rudbeckia hirta Miss Lollipop, I just made that up, but Rudbeckia hirta Miss Lollipop, as soon as you have a name in parentheses beside the scientific name, that means it's a cultivar of the original plant. That means it's been bred into a certain strain, we'll say. So when you're choosing native plants, you'll see a lot of nativars. So New England aster, for example, or echinacea. These are all plants that are native, but that have been bred into particular cultivars for the horticultural industry. And what research is increasingly showing is that many of these just don't provide the same benefits in terms of pollen and nectar to pollinators that the original native plant does. So, and then of course, it's complicated. The more cross selection, the more hybridization there is, the fewer benefits generally there are. The closer it is still to the true native, the more confident you can be that that cultivar of a native plant is still providing pollen and nectar. In my field, the other thing that we watch out for is provenance, and we use a term called ecotype. So for example, black-eyed Susan. Black-eyed Susan has a huge range in North America. Lots of places in North America, black-eyed Susan is a native plant. But the black-eyed Susan you find in Kansas is not the same black-eyed Susan you will find in the Laurentians. And that's because their genetics have adapted to those very different conditions. And so when I'm looking for native plants, I'm trying to find those whose ecotypes are the closest to the location where I'm planting. And so it's a good question to ask when you're going to a nursery, and they might not even be able to answer you. What's the ecotype? Where did the source plant come from? And the closer you can get it, the better it is for you as a gardener, because it means this plant is better adapted to your conditions, but also because genetic diversity is another aspect of biodiversity that's important to maintain and protect. A lot of these native plants, they're harder and harder to find in the landscape because of habitat destruction. And so not only are we losing numbers of plants and places where we can find these plants, but also the genetic diversity within a native plant's population is also becoming smaller. So it's important to try to protect that diversity. Okay, now we get to the photos. So I'm going to show you a bunch of photos, many of which are from my own garden. And basically because I didn't want to write text, I'm sure a lot of you are tired of Zoom presentation and reading after spending all day, but also because I think this really tells you the story. So this is one of my favorite flowers. It's an early bloomer. So this time of year, it's starting to, it's starting to bloom now. It will be blooming very soon. It's called harebell, Campanula rotundifolia. And it's so pretty. And what you're seeing, this little bee spent the night sleeping in the flower. And so this is in the morning. I go out to my garden and the sun has just started to hit the bloom. The bee is starting to warm up and it's starting to come out of the flower. So not only does this flower provide food for the bee, it also provides a shelter and also a great thing to observe early in the morning when I'm having my coffee. This was the most popular flower in my garden last year by a long shot. It's called Helens Flower, Helenium autumnale. And this was popular with everything. Everything that collects pollen or drinks nectar was going to this plant. And it was extremely easy to grow. I planted the plugs, which are, just the kind of the root ball from first year plants in November in a corner of my garden that had been a literal garbage dump for my landlord. Very compacted soil, full of garbage, no amendments. I planted this, there were maybe 10 or 15 plugs, and they came up in the summer and they just filled the whole place. And there was always full of activity and just totally gorgeous. And so here you see bumblebees nectaring. This is not from my garden actually, and sorry for the out of focus, but these are two of my favorite springtime flowers. And these are both flowers that do well in part shade, so anyone that has shady conditions. What you see in the foreground is wild columbine, Canadian columbine. And in the background is wild geranium. So these are native flowers, and here they're occurring naturally in a forest. And so I love to look for nature to see what combination of plants. So we know these like the same conditions, they look gorgeous together. And so these are the kinds of cues that I like to take. So if there are any natural areas in near where you live, I definitely recommend going for walks throughout the year to take note of what's blooming. And this is my front garden and my cat, Minu. Oh wait, no, that's Sebastian. That's my neighbor's cat. He's not as nice. He's very handsome though. So this is my front garden, and it's, I would say part shade. It gets some really hot afternoon sun, but otherwise has shade in the morning and then in the afternoon and in the evening as well. It's very dry because it's under a silver maple and it's surrounded by concrete and a paved surface. I kind of water it sometimes, definitely not every day, maybe a few times a week if it's really hot. This is in early June. And what you see here flowering here at the very front are the wild strawberries. To the right, you have wild chives. At the front, you have foxglove beard tongue, which makes a really beautiful white flower. You see the little purple flowers of the harebell. You don't see the wild columbine quite yet, but it's going to appear in a few weeks. And at the back on the right, that sort of whitish colored flower is Pearly Everlasting, which is a really easy to grow plant. When it's happy, it just takes over, so also be warned. But it's a great plant because it's the host to the American painted lady butterfly. And last year when I planted it, a butterfly deposited its eggs the very next day. I had just planted it and it had already become a host plant for the butterfly. Here's the view just from the side of that same spot, about 6 weeks later, I think. So, oh no, that's way later. So that's in August. So a lot of the spring flowers aren't blooming anymore. The Pearly Everlasting, which I was just talking about, is now blooming. That's the white puffs in the back. You've got your black-eyed Susan, of course, which is a favorite for many birds. The seeds feed a lot of birds. Also, the antenna bee, longhorn bees, sorry, they love this plant. And at the back, you see a great plant for part shade, which is the sweet oxeye, it's called. And again, these are plants that do well in sun and part shade and that require very little watering. Does anyone recognize what flower this is? This is
It looks like a
raspberry.
berry.
Raspberry.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So raspberry, and then with the official bee of Toronto, the punk rock bee, feeding on it. So this is the pearly everlasting I was just telling you about. So here we have really interesting situation, because what we're looking at is a European wool carder bee. So this is actually not a native species. It made its way somehow to North America and naturalized. It's not invasive. It's just kind of made its way into the whole balance of things. It's a solitary bee. And what it does is it lines its nest with plant fibers. So what we're looking at right now is the bee collecting the fibers off of the stem of the plant to go and line its nest. This is one of my favorite flowers, the dense blazing star. It's not quite native in Quebec. Southwestern Ontario, it really is its most northeast range, but you'll see this plant in a lot of gardens across Canada. You will find lots of nativars of it. I do recommend trying to find a true native from Southwest Ontario if you want to plant it, but this one is really rich in nectar and a favorite of butterflies. But here we are looking at a bumblebee, of course. Here are some photos from my garden. So it's a bit wild, and I'll just give you a bit of background. So the flowers we're looking at, they grew in that garbage pile I was telling you about. So it was quite literally the back corner of the garden between the fence and the dilapidated shed. Our landlord over the years had just been throwing debris, including pieces of cement, some like garbage, like full-on garbage. There was broken glass and cans and bottles and plastic and all kinds of things. So we cleaned it up, but we didn't amend the soil and we didn't till it. Oh, and we also had every kind of invasive species that my roommates and I, like over the course of a season, really tried to take care of. They're still there. The invasive species are still there. We're in an urban area, they're everywhere. So we just try to manage them. We can't eradicate them. But all this to say that this is actually quite a tough area to plant. And I had all of these leftover plugs in November. There was no above ground vegetation. I didn't even know what I was planting anymore. I didn't even know if I could plant them that late because often the ground heaves through the frosting and thawing. But there was nothing to lose. I planted all these plugs, and this is the very next year. This is year 1 of this garden, and it's so lush. You also see my landlord's cannabis plant, which not pollinated, but it is there in the garden. And you see a little further back, you see the tomatoes and the raspberries and some vegetables. Oh, and on the left are some wonderful flowers. These tend to love moisture. I don't know how they survived in that corner, but the red cardinal flower, which you'll often see on the side of lakes, it's a favorite of hummingbirds. And the white bone set, also a beautiful plant. And in the back, the great blue lobelia. On the left is wild bergamot, a really beautiful plant. It's so stunning. In the middle is the Helens Flower again with a male bumblebee sleeping underneath. This is early in the morning. And then to the right is the buds of the yet to open ironweed, which is a really cool, really beautiful plant. And here is a great species, Joe Pieweed, which is in the Eupatorium family. And you'll see this all over Quebec. And this is actually from Lac du Poisson Blanc when I went camping. And I just invite you to have a look at the many, many species of pollinators that are found on this flower. This plant is amazing. It can handle lots of different conditions, including sun, part shade, and moist conditions. And it's just a total pollinator magnet. And it's beautiful. It's really gorgeous. It grows tall though. So if you want it in your garden, I recommend putting it at the back and putting smaller things at the front. So I mentioned butterflies and host plants. Butterflies tend to have very close relationships with a specific plant or a family of plants. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the monarch butterfly and the milkweeds. Just about every butterfly or moth you see out there has that kind of relationship. And so it's really great to plant in our gardens the host plants. So this, I love this example here. This is actually not native to your area, but I love the caterpillar so much I wanted to show it to you. This is the spice bush swallowtail. So the top left is the flowering spice bush. And then on the bottom is the spice bush swallowtail caterpillar, which feeds on the bush, of course. And then the adult is the butterfly that we see in the top right. And so these relationships, these plants, they're everywhere around us, and we can bring them right into our garden. And it's great because then you get to see these gorgeous butterflies and their caterpillars. So for anyone who has kids or grandkids, it's really fun because you can watch these transformations over the course of the season. We talked a lot about flowers. Trees and shrubs are an incredibly important part of the garden. Of course, if you're talking about design, you want some vertical structure, you want texture, you want screening. Trees and shrubs play a huge role. But they're also very important to pollinators. In fact, at this time of year, early spring, the main source of pollen in the landscape are trees and shrubs. So right now, bees are going a lot to sugar maples and to willows. Those are some of the main sources of pollen for the bees out there. Oaks, I think, was it Diane who was talking about oaks? Oaks are what they call a keystone species. We have a few species of oak, but oaks are a powerhouse tree. They feed so many, just over 500 species of moths and butterflies rely on oak as their host plant. And that's hugely important because birds, 95% of birds, their babies eat caterpillars. If we don't have trees, like native trees like oaks, we don't have caterpillars. We don't have caterpillars, we don't have birds. So to plant a native tree, something like a native oak or a native maple, the birches, the willows, all these trees play a huge role in this complex food chain. On the right, you see a tree, the serviceberry. It's the Amelanchier family, and there are lots of different species of serviceberries across Canada. There are also a lot of them that are found in nurseries that may or not be native to your area, that may be cultivars. If you can, I recommend finding one that's truly native to your area. But you know, if it's out there, it's a gorgeous tree, and they do provide pollen and nectar. They're beautiful, and they also make berries that are edible, not only for cedar waxwings, but humans too. They're very tasty. You can make berries and ice cream and pie and all kinds of things. And then in the fall, the leaves turn a really beautiful orange. So this serviceberry, this is like all season winter. And I'm just going to wrap up quickly with, I still have quite a few slides, so tell me if you want me to speed ahead. But this is my friend Lorraine Johnson's front garden in Toronto. It's not very big. These are mostly native plants. There's a Japanese maple that's not native, but you see a young oak planted in front of that. Beside it is the Eastern Redbud, which is a gorgeous and stunning native tree that is native to your part of Quebec. It's just a beautiful example of a naturalized garden, and this is going to have interest all year round. Throughout the season, something is going to be blooming. So you're going to see this change over the course of the season, which is just beautiful. And it's very lush. Lorraine is the author of several books, including this classic, which is the 100 Easy to Grow Native Plants. I highly recommend it, especially as a sort of introduction to the topic. I also wanted to give an example of native plant gardening in the suburbs. So this is a friend of a friend who is in, I think, Minnesota, somewhere in the Midwest United States. And his name is Ben Vogt. He has this Instagram account. You don't need to be on Instagram to have it. You can just look it up online. Monarch Gardens Benjamin Vogt, V-O-G-T. But he does incredible landscaping all with native plants. And it's just gorgeous to see this landscape really come to life, something that can be very sterile, but that really comes to life. Now, of course, this is an extreme. This is not going to appeal to everyone. You can have a native plant garden that doesn't look like a natural meadow, that looks like a more manicured or more symmetrical, more sort of French classic garden. And you can do that with native plants. Absolutely, you can do that with native plants. But I did want to show you an example of what's possible in terms of naturalizing our landscapes. Now, this, for anyone who's interested in landscape design at the professional level, this person is very interesting. He's a Dutch designer called Pieweed, and he uses not only native plants, but a lot of native plants, depending on the region where he's working. He works all over the world. But I think one thing to note is the way he brings species together in the garden to create these really naturalized landscapes. And what I'll point out is he does large groupings, and that is very effective as a design. It's also conveniently very good for pollinators, because for bees or butterflies to forage, it takes a lot of energy. So if all the plants that are blooming of one kind are together, it's easier for them to forage. And most pollinators will choose to forage on one plant at a time. So they'll do all of the echinacea, for example, and they won't go between the echinacea and the wild rose and the wild bergamot. They'll focus on one at a time. So these kind of mass plantings, they're very pleasing to the human eye, and they're also very efficient for pollinators. One principle I want to share with you is the 3x3 rule. So if you do this, you're doing great. The principle is to have 3 blooming plants in the garden for each of the 3 seasons. So 3 different species for spring into early summer, 3 for early to midsummer, and then 3 for the later part of the season, so late summer into fall. And in this way, you have a continuous bloom. Also add a diversity of color and shape. That means you're going to be feeding a huge diversity of pollinators. So of course, diversity is key.
Hi, Kathleen. We're coming up to about an 8 to 8:30, so wonder if we can.
Okay, I'm really wondering.
Wonder if we can take some questions soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just leave this slide quickly for anyone who's wondering where to get native plants. There are 3 that I know of in Quebec. Aiglon Indigo is quite big. There's also Pépinière Rustique and Beaux-Arbres, which is smaller. That's in the Gatineau area. But lots of garden centers are starting to carry native plants, even if they themselves are not specialized in native plants.
Are we ready to take some questions? Sorry, Kathleen, I can't hear you.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I thought you were asking the group, but yes, absolutely.
Okay. So I'm going to stop the recording now.